Book of Amos. Amos chapter 6 is where we're going to study tonight. Bid you a pleasant good evening. It's good to see you. I hope you've had a good day. Today's kind of a special day for me on several accounts as the day has gone along. At about this time of the evening on June the 14th, 26 years ago, Tracy and I were standing in front of my dad exchanging our marriage vows. And so today is our 26th anniversary. You know, God gives us a lot of gifts in our lives, and sometimes we don't appreciate them at the time. It takes time to appreciate just how good God is in some of the gifts He's given us. And that has certainly been the case with Tracy in my life. She's put up with a lot and continues to do so. And I am grateful to God for her and for our time together. I love you, and happy anniversary. And I pray for my girls every day that God will give them someone that will help them go to heaven. And for those of you who are parents who are raising your kids, let me make that suggestion to you, that you get in the habit and make it a habit. Make it something that is, when you talk to God, it's going to be a part of it, and you can't talk to God without it, that your prayer is incomplete. If you do not address to God the future, the marital future of your children. So it's a great day in that regard. I would also note that my closest friend, who I have, we went to high school together. He's one of our elders. We are together a good bit. We hunt and fish together. We have been close friends, probably the closest thing I have to a brother. He has a son who was born 2 days before we wed. And John is the boy's name. John has terminal cancer. And he became a father today also. 2:15 this morning, my phone went off, and John and his wife Reagan have a new son. And so a lot of celebration. My girls are looking at me. They didn't know. Tracy didn't tell them. Axel Everest. Okay? So there's just all kinds of things to celebrate in our world today, and so we're grateful to the Lord. I hope you've had a good day. I can pretty much guarantee you haven't had as good a day as I have had, but it's been a good day. I appreciate you being here tonight. I hope that our study will be of some profit to you, and I've appreciated all your kindness, the things that you've had to say about our studies thus far. One of the things I've noticed as I've gone through this process of raising a family is how vastly different is the life that my children experience compared to my youth. I am at that point where I'm telling them, you know, when I was a kid, and I think back that my parents did the same thing to us. I will tell you when this first became very apparent to me. We, for a long time, we didn't eat out very much, except on Sunday night. Sunday night was the go out and eat night. So after services, 2 or 3 families would all go get pizza or something, and the girls got accustomed to that. So much so that I distinctly remember one evening that, for whatever reason, we were going to go home after services, and my kids, all 3 of the girls, you would have thought somebody had shot the dog when we said, we're not going to eat tonight, we're going home. Oh, it was tragic. The world was coming to an end because we weren't going out to eat. And of course, at that point you have to make the when I was a kid story, and I told them about the terrible things that we had to eat and how poor we were, and there was some truth to that. I don't remember eating out, honestly, as a kid, till I was probably in junior high. And if I mention that to my folks, they just kind of shake their head like, well, they didn't even have food when we were kids, you know. We had to go to school uphill 27 miles in the snow, in a sandstorm. And it's interesting that as each generation, especially in this country, has come along, that there is a level of prosperity and a level, I think that you probably have to go beyond the description of prosperity and describe it as luxury. That each subsequent generation is experiencing that is far beyond what the last one experienced. And honestly, as I've gotten older, it kind of scares me because I don't know what's going to happen with my girls and eventually the families they have, and if the Lord, if the Lord doesn't come back, what's going to happen with the next generation? Is there going to be a coming back to center, or are we just going to continue to get more and more prosperous? Because we live in a generation where, in a culture where pleasure, prosperity, leisure, those things are important. In fact, we have a description for it in our culture. It is the American dream. The American dream is to be better off than your parents were, and to enjoy life more, to retire earlier, to travel, to enjoy entertainment, to enjoy recreation, to eat things, to take life in, to suck the very marrow out of it. And in our culture, that's just kind of where everybody is aiming. And if you don't believe that, just look around. Look at the entertainment options that are available. Look at the recreation options that are available. Look at, we're staying in a hotel this week. I am amazed every night that place fills up. Well, what that says is there's a lot of people that aren't home right now. They're traveling and watching people come and go. They're not all here working. They're vacationing. They're traveling. This is the world that we live in. And I must tell you that can become problematic. Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 3, as he warns him about what he calls perilous times that are coming, one of the things that he warns him about is the propensity of mankind to give himself to pleasure. He says in 2 Timothy 3 and verse 1, "Know that in the last days perilous times will come. Men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God." I think that's an interesting list. Because in the list, in the middle of it, there's all this what we think of as rank ungodliness. But at the beginning of it, it's lovers of pleasure and lovers of selves. And at the end of it, it is lovers of the beginning is lovers of money. The end is lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. And I must tell you, in my opinion, that's kind of where our culture's headed, if it's not already there. And even when Paul writes this to Timothy, this is not a new problem. That's why I want to give your attention to the book of Amos. If you've got your bookmark in chapter 6, and I'm going to read through the first few verses there, I want you to notice, I want you to back up, keep your bookmark in chapter 6, and I want you to notice how often God, through Amos, warns these people or rebukes them about their temporality. It's not just materialism, but their devotion to what is sensual, to what feeds the body. And so I'm going to run through several passages. Amos 2, beginning in verse 6. "Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4 I will not turn away its punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver, and the poor for a pair of sandals. They pant after the dust of the earth that's on the head of the poor. They pervert the way of the humble. A man and his father go into the same girl to defile my holy name. They lie down by every altar on clothes taken in pledge. They drink the wine of the condemned in the house of their God." Go over to chapter 3. Look at verses 12 and following. "Thus says the Lord, as a shepherd takes from the mouth of a lion 2 legs or a piece of an ear, so the children of Israel will be taken out who dwell in Samaria, in the corner of a bed and on the edge of a couch. Hear and testify against the house of Jacob. Thus says the Lord God, the God of hosts, in that day I punish Israel for their transgressions. I will also visit destruction on the altars of Bethel, and the horns of the altar will be cut off and fall to the ground. I'll destroy the winter house along with the summer house. The houses of Ivory shall perish. The great houses shall have an end, says the Lord." Chapter 4, first couple of verses. "Hear this, you cows of Bashan." Sorry, ladies, he's talking about the women. "Hear this, you cows of Bashan who are on the mountain of Samaria, who oppress the poor and crush the needy, who say to your husbands, Bring wine and let us drink. The Lord God has sworn by His holiness, behold, the days will come upon you when He will take you away with fish hooks and your posterity with fish hooks. And then chapter 5, beginning in verse 10. They hate the one who rebukes in the gate. They abhor the one who speaks uprightly. Therefore, because you tread down the poor, you take grain taxes from him. Though you have built houses of hewn stone, you will not dwell in them. You planted pleasant vineyards, you will not drink wine from them. I know your manifold transgressions and your mighty sins, afflicting the just, taking bribes, diverting the poor from justice at the gate. Therefore the prudent keep silent at that time, for it is an evil time. And then finally, the passage that I want to give your attention to, beginning in verse 1 from chapter 6. Woe to you who are at ease in Zion, and trust in Mount Samaria, notable persons in the chief nation to whom the house of Israel comes. Go over to Calneh and see. From there go to Hamath the great, then down to Gath of the Philistines. Are you better than these kingdoms? Is your territory greater? Is their territory greater than yours? Woe to you who put far off the day of doom, who cause the seat of violence to come near, who lie on beds of ivory and stretch out on your couches and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the midst of the stall, who sing idly to the sound of string instruments and invent for yourselves musical instruments like David, who drink wine from bowls and anoint yourself with the best ointments, but are not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. Therefore they shall go captive as the first of the captives, and those who recline at banquets shall be removed. Amos is prophesying during the reign of Jeroboam. It would be the second Jeroboam, not Jeroboam the son of Nebat, but the second Jeroboam. And this would have been somewhere in the vicinity of 790 to 750 AD, about 30 years before the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom. This was a period of time at the heels of which the northern kingdom of Israel has been terribly abused by the nation of Syria. Not Assyria, but Syria. And because the children of Israel had suffered so greatly under the Syrians' hands, what God had done is He had raised up Jeroboam. Wasn't necessarily a righteous man, but He raised him up and He used him as a vehicle to deliver His people from their grief. And I'm going to come back to that late in the sermon. But the point is that God had blessed them and prospered them at a level, as best I can tell, that almost approaches that of Solomon. When Jeroboam II was king, and history seems to bear this out, the nation of Israel was as prosperous as they had been for probably 200 years. And yet, what God through Amos says to them constantly is, you've made the blessings your end-all, be-all in life. I want to talk to you for a few minutes, folks, about our propensity for temporal pleasure and our propensity for material wealth and our temporality. Because what I see in my life as one of the grand temptations that I have to face is the idea of covetousness and materialism and simply enjoying life to the point that it becomes distracting. And we're not always comfortable talking about this. We like to talk about stuff where we see sins in others. But I want you to know that this may well be the greatest threat that God's people face in this day and age. And so I want to make a couple of observations, and then I want to offer an admonition. And here's the first observation. The rampant pursuit of temporal pleasure, whether you want to talk about accumulating money or whether you want to just talk about living life to its fullest, the rampant pursuit of temporal pleasure is a very empty pursuit. And that's something that the Bible bears out consistently. It is the theme, essentially, of Ecclesiastes. And it's empty for several reasons. First of all, for those of you, and myself included, who tend to get caught up in all the here and the now, and whether it's the money or whether it's the golf or whether it is your education or whether it is your employment or whatever you're giving yourself to that's going to end when you die, the problem with the pursuit of that first and foremost is ultimately it's not going to be very satisfying. It is something that we're going to have to do over and over and over. Do you remember for those of you who are grown, did you remember your first new car? Do you remember Sunday and me asking, if I ask you a question, I need you to do this if the answer is yes? Do you remember at least about, okay, let's go a little farther back. Do you remember your first new car? Was it something that you had looked at, that you'd driven, that you'd gotten in and smelled the new car smell? Mine was a 1985, 83 Ford pickup truck. F100 step-side blue and white with a blue interior. Oh, it was beautiful. And I can remember wanting that so bad and getting a job so that I could save up the money, and Dad went down and co-signed for me, and I made all the payments, and boy, I tell you, that was just the greatest thing in the world. Till it wasn't. Do you remember getting a new car, and then before very long, the new models come out, and they changed them just a little bit. And you start looking at yours and going, well, this is great, but it's not a four-wheel drive. And it doesn't have cruise control on it. And you know, it's interesting to me that that's kind of typical of life in general. We want something desperately bad, and we work hard to get it, and when we get it, the feeling it's visceral, it's emotional. It's like, yes, I finally got it. And then about 2 or 3 days later, the payments hit you, or the new models hit you, or you start to see what the reality is. That the next thing you know, you start looking for it again. And our tendency is to do that from one thing to another thing to another thing to another thing. Now, we ought to figure this out, and we ought to figure this out in regards to one of the basic needs in life. Did you eat today? Yes? Are you going to eat again? Yes. Why? Weren't you satisfied with what you ate? Well, yeah, but we get hungry again. I think that's kind of interesting. As you go back and you read Ecclesiastes, that's kind of the point that Solomon is trying to make as he goes through the entirety of his search for meaning in life. And he tells us at the very beginning in chapter 1 and verse 8, all things are full of labor, man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. You go hunt, you kill the animal you think you've always wanted to kill, but the next thing you know, you're ready to go hunting again. And we do that with everything in life, and the reason we do that, folks, is because life in and of itself doesn't satisfy us. Now, you get that, don't you? That's not hard to figure out. Because let me ask you something. If that is the case, why is it that we engage in that process over and over? And to me, that's a kind of a sobering question. What it says is, it's real easy, even though we know the new car's not going to satisfy us, or the new job's not going to satisfy us, or a raise is not going to completely satisfy us, that we're still going to be yearning for more, that maybe we need to kind of get off of that mentality that's always looking for something better than what we have. And the sooner we come to grips with that, the less we will be inclined to the rampant pursuit of pleasure. Let me offer you another one. The pursuit of pleasure in temporal things is vain and empty because it doesn't offer much security to us. Jesus deals with this in Matthew chapter 6. In fact, Jesus deals with materialism, I think probably in the Gospels, as best I can tell, as much as any subject that he deals with. In Matthew chapter 6, this is a passage familiar to most of us, beginning in verse 19, do not lay up for yourselves treasure upon the earth. And the first thing that he addresses about that is, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. And Jesus at the very outset of this admonition says, I want you to understand something about treasures on the earth. Treasures on the earth are not very secure things, and we are obsessed with security. We get something, and we want to make sure nobody takes it from us. So we get our money, we go put it in a bank. We get a car. How many of you locked your car when you came in? Everybody. Why? Somebody wants it. They're going to steal it, whether it's locked or not. But there is this illusion that somehow or the other we can accumulate, we can get things, and somehow or the other that insulates us. More money insulates us from hunger or from debt. And the more things we experience, then we're not yearning for all these things. And if you go back to Amos, one of the things that you would note as you read through the book, and it's very clear in chapter 6, is that these people were confident because they were prosperous. We see that in our country as well. Notice that he begins chapter 6, "Woe to you who are at ease in Zion." Now Zion's talking to Judah, not the northern kingdom, but the southern. And then, "Woe to you who trust in Mount Samaria." And it's significant that he used those two geographic locations because both of those were the capital cities. And there were defenses built in Zion and in Samaria. And the people looked at the things they had built and the fact that they had shut out the world, and they were secure. Nobody could mess with them. And yet what we realize is we can lock things up, we can accumulate money, we can try to insulate ourselves. But when hardship comes, hardship comes. You can't stop a tornado from tearing things up. You can't avoid necessarily getting some heinous disease. If somebody breaks in and robs you blind, you can't necessarily stop that. And the point is, all these things that we do and that we accumulate really don't provide security. In fact, just the opposite is true. You know what happens when you lay up treasures on the earth? The proverbial writer says it's just more you have to worry about. So here's my question. I think everybody's in agreement with that, right? That it doesn't really secure life. Why do we give ourselves to it with the same degree of passion that we do? And then let me make a third little observation about the vanity of all this. The obvious and the most significant thing about temporal experience and sensuality and material things is there's just no real future there. And the reason there's not any future is they do not outlast death. I want you to turn back to Ecclesiastes with me very quickly. And I want you to notice Solomon, as he goes through this grand experiment, and most of you are probably familiar with it, in chapter 2 he talks about all these things that he tried that just didn't satisfy him. And his observation is life under the sun. And the meaning is, if you take away the spiritual aspect of life, life under the sun is just an empty, profitless existence. And he is right. And the big reason he comes back to this over and over is because of death. And he says it 2 or 3 times. In chapter 2, begin reading with me in verse 18. He says, "I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I've toiled, in which I've shown myself wise under the sun. This is vanity." Go over, if you would, at this point to chapter 5 and begin reading in verse 13. Chapter 5 and verse 13. "There's a severe evil that I've seen under the sun. Riches kept for their owner to his hurt. But those riches perish through misfortune. When he begets a son, there's nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return to go as he came. He shall take nothing from his labor which he may carry away in his hand." And then the ultimate expression in Ecclesiastes is found beginning in chapter 9. Chapter 9 and verse 2. Solomon says, "All things come alike to all. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good, the clean, and the unclean, to him who sacrifices, to him who does not sacrifice. As is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath, as he who fears an oath. There is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that one thing happens to all. Truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live, and after that they go to the dead." What I want you to get from this point is that we need to be really balanced about living in a society that is so given over to material, experiential, sensual temporality. Because the illusion of the American dream is if we'll do better than our parents, and if our kids will transcend us in their life experience, life will be worth living. And the reality is, that's a lie. Satan tried that on the Lord in the temptations of Matthew chapter 4 when he took him up on the mountaintop and he showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a glance and said, if you'll bow down, I'll give you all of this. And it was a shortcut, I think, in Satan's mind to Jesus establishing this kingdom that he came to rule over. But the point is, he offered all that life had out there to try to tempt Jesus to take the shortcut and to put his investment in a place that's not wise. I find this to be a problem that's devastating among Christians. And I don't know one Christian who does not deal with the temptation of it. So I want you to appreciate, I want you to think this through, that the rampant pursuit of temporal pleasure is a vain thing. It doesn't satisfy, it does not provide freedom or security to us, and ultimately everything we do here we leave behind. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't ever go out and eat, that you can't ever go play golf. There is a balance that has to be maintained here. But the point is, this is not who we are and what life is about. And I think a lot of Christians need to step back and examine themselves and make sure that that's not their priority. Now, second point that I would make about this, and that is that this pursuit of this temporal existence that we've introduced is a very dangerous mindset to get caught up in. And it's a dangerous mindset for several reasons. One is because it's very deceptive. If I were to ask you, do you think it's a sin to have money? The chances are pretty good you would say no. In fact, the chances are pretty good, those of you who are good Bible students would say, no, it's not money that's wrong. It's the love of money that's the root of all evil, 1 Timothy chapter 6, and I think you're right. But the reality is this pattern of living that we get into where all that life is about is the here and the now and the doing and the accumulating, it's deceptive because it's sinful and we don't see it. Turn over to the book of Ephesians, if you would. Ephesians chapter 5. One of the issues with temporality, and we've already taken note of that as we talked about satisfaction, is that very often what happens is we get caught up in a pattern of wanting more or better or something a little beyond what we have right now. We'd like to have a little bit of a raise. We'd like to have a little more money. We'd like to have a little better car. We'd like to have a better set of golf clubs. We'd like to have a new shotgun. We'd like to have a new kitchen. It is the way that we are programmed in our culture to think. You know what the Bible calls that? Covetousness. Covetousness is the rank desire for more. And it is something that we need to be warned about that there is no stigma attached to in our nation. Have you ever heard somebody say, you know, that guy over there, he's a sinful man. He's a sinful man because he's always wanting more than he has. He's been wanting to get a Super Duty 3/4 ton pickup truck with a diesel engine, 4-wheel drive with a King Ranch package. He's been wanting that for years. That's one sinful man right there. Would you identify someone who had that kind of desire as sinful? Ephesians chapter 5, when we are told that we are followers of God and children that are to be walking in the light. Look at verse 3. Fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness. Notice fornication. Okay, that's a big bad sin in our mind. Oh, uncleanness. Oh, that's big bad stuff. And the rank desire for more. Let it not even be named among you as is fitting for saints, neither filthiness or foolish talking or coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. You know this, that no fornicator or unclean person or covetous man, listen, who is an idolater, has any inheritance of the kingdom of God. You want to know the way God sees the American dream, folks? He sees it in a form of idolatry. But that's not the way our country offers it. That's not the way Hollywood offers it. It's not the way that Wall Street and the business sector and the advertising sector offers the American dream. Nobody attaches a stigma to desiring more. But when our life is going from one desire for more to another desire for more, it is an exceptionally dangerous thing. And it is dangerous because that deception becomes our God. It consumes us. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 1, the Apostle Paul says, if you're risen with Christ, seek those things that are above where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. Set your affection on things above and not on things of the earth. And we read that, and very often we underscore the first part of that passage, that we're supposed to be spiritually minded people. But we kind of miss the second part of the passage where he says, set your mind on things above and not on things of the earth. And the reality is that when we give ourselves to the things of the earth, we fail to give ourselves to God. You know, Jesus said in the same passage we read from Matthew chapter 6 a while ago, you can't serve two masters. You're going to love the one and hate the other. You're going to hold to the one and despise the other. You can't serve God and mammon, the love of material things, the love of money. And yet, I see it in my life. I see it in the lives of the people that I work with regularly. My guess is if I got to spend a little time with you, I would see it in your lives. And what's the object of our life? Where's our time? Where's our attention? Where's our zeal? Where's our devotion? Where do we put our resources? What are our priorities? I'm going to tell you, this is a particularly devastating time, a challenge when you're raising your children, and especially as they get a little older, because this one is in the band and plays soccer. This one is in the band and in choir, and we just go from one thing to another all the time. And we've tried to limit that. My oldest played soccer and was in the choir. And when school's in, Tuesday nights, Friday night soccer games, or during football season, Fridays are football games, and they've got marching band practice after school, and then we've got homework over here. And we limited them so you can only play one sport or one at a time. I know people that go from baseball to basketball to Pop Warner football to soccer, and then back to baseball and basketball and football and soccer. And life is just a pursuit. And then we're going to take our kids, it's not good enough to play rec ball at home. We're going to go to Houston every weekend, which is an hour and a half drive, and who knows how much gasoline and time and expense staying in hotels and eating over there while we can compete at a higher level. And y'all see it, don't you? Do you know people whose lives are completely consumed with their kids' sports or their kids' activities? Do you? You tell me. Is that not idolatry? I mean, the kid doesn't become the God, but the activity does. Nobody would say this is my idol, but what I give my passion to, what I give my attention to, what I give my zeal to, what I give my priority to, what I give my time to, what I give my resources to, what I give my affection to, that's who I'm worshiping. And you see the same thing, people will do that with their job. You will see the same thing, people will do that with their grandkids. Sorry, grandparents. You'll see people do that with their recreation. It doesn't have to be their kids' lives. And it's rampant. We have a hard time when we have gospel meetings at home. And we try really hard to bring in people that we think are easy to listen to and really capable at helping people to understand the Bible, and not only helping them understand it, but move them to that. And we'll have folks that we don't see all week in a gospel meeting. And the reason that we don't see them is for all the reasons that I just listed. And then if you preach on priorities, people get upset about that because they say, well, that's not fair. I love the Lord. Are you seeking first the kingdom of God and His righteousness? And the reality is that this temporal life that we lead becomes consuming to the point that the Ephesian writer, Paul, says that covetous is just idolatry. And you can see it that way. So we need to be careful about that. We need to understand how deceptive it is. We need to understand that that then can lead to other sins. We don't see it as idolatry, but it is idolatry. And then when we get caught up in it, we can neglect the blessings of God. We can lose sense of our priorities. We can become so self-consumed that we don't have time to take care of others. And once you become selfish, then all of these things that we think of as rank ungodliness becomes a part of a person's life. How in the world can a godly man or a godly woman get involved in illicit sexual relationship? Well, I can tell you how that happens. At some point, that godly man or godly woman became a selfish man or a selfish woman. And when you become selfish, then you start pursuing things that you want. And it is a slippery slope that you slide down. When you start giving yourself to the pursuit of pleasure in this life. If you go back to Amos, flip back over to where we started. And I've read most of these sections. I just want to touch on them again, so I'm not going to read them, but if you'll reference them. Chapter 2, beginning in verse 6, listen to the sins. Talks about disregard for others, talks about injustice, talks about sexual immorality, talks about intemperance. In chapter 4, he talks about oppression and drunkenness and empty religion. You know, we're out pursuing the idol of soccer or money or retirement 50, 60 hours a week. And then we come to services on Sunday and think that we're fooling God and everybody else into the idea that, yes, this is where our priority is. God says they're doing the same thing. That's just hypocrisy. Chapter 5, it's intolerance of what is right. It is robbery and dishonesty and injustice. And then in chapter 6, I think he epitomizes the whole thing. We're so caught up in eating from the flock and our beds of ivory and being at ease that we are not grieved for what's going on around us. I'm going to tell you, folks, when you're obsessed with hunting season rolling around, you're not going to care too much about whether the guy down the street's about to go to hell if he dies today. Because all you're thinking about is, man, it is time to go hunt. And again, I'm not arguing that these things are in and of themselves wrong. What I'm saying is that our culture promotes them as the end-all, be-all of life, and it's a dangerous way to think. It's deceptive. It becomes idolatrous. It leads to other sins. And then finally, it makes us draw false conclusions about God. One of the most interesting things about Amos is that they saw these blessings as a testament to God's acceptance of them. And there's a bit of irony here because in the old law in Deuteronomy 27 and 28, what God told them is, if you're faithful, I'll bless you. And indeed, you see in David's age and Solomon's age that they became a very wealthy people and they enjoyed the blessings of God. And the blessings of God, He wants to pour out upon us. The problem is we become obsessed with them. And that's why He warns them in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Talk to your children as you walk by the way and as you lie down and as you rise up, and make them as blinders before your eyes. Because when I bring you into the land and you have vineyards you didn't plant and you have wells you didn't dig and you had houses that you didn't build and you're going to enjoy all these blessings that I've given you, you're going to forget about me. And that's what's happening in our country. Have you ever heard people say, America's a Christian nation? We're a blessed nation. Look at all that God has done for us and given us. Do you really believe that? I think God has greatly blessed this nation at times, but I don't believe this is a Christian nation. I think it's a nation that's fooled himself into saying that is our predominant religion. But if we were a quote-unquote Christian nation, we'd be a lot more godly than we are. We fooled ourselves into thinking that because we are a wealthy nation, that God's happy with us. And that was a problem and a mistake that the Jews made in their thinking about God. So, here's our observations so far. This life that we are encouraged to lead, it's a vain existence. It doesn't satisfy us. It doesn't provide security to us. And death is going to bear it out as being not worth our time. And the second point that we've tried to make about that is it's a very dangerous and deceptive kind of life. Because because it gives us the appearance that everything's okay when we're really involved in covetousness and idolatry, and we're consumed and obsessed with it, and it leads to other sins, and eventually we misunderstand God. So, what do we do about that? I'm not going to finish right here. If I did, everybody would go out like, what am I supposed to do? Now I'm going to go quit my job. No. We are a blessed people, and I think this idea of living in a world where our beds are ivory, and ours are, I think it brings a couple of responsibilities that I want to encourage in us as we finish up. The first one is the responsibility of gratitude. As you go through Amos, what becomes very apparent is that these people were so involved in enjoying the blessings of God that they forgot the giver. And I think that that's very easy for us to do. That we become people who forget about the good God that we serve. And we live a wonderful life. I think it's an impediment to us sometimes when it comes to trying to teach the gospel, because, man, when you've got a 2,500 square foot air conditioned house, and you don't have to worry about the heat, you don't have to worry about the cold, and you get to go play golf, and you get to go eat a hamburger when you want to, and you get to go do the things that you want to do, and you got medicine where you feel pretty good. I mean, who wants to go to heaven? Life in Oklahoma City is pretty good. And I think there's a lot of people that are kind of that way. But I'm going to tell you what the good life ought to show us. Can you imagine how grand heaven really is? If God would bless His people the way that He has blessed His people in Jeroboam's day, He blessed them because He was concerned that they were being abused, that they were being mistreated by the Syrians. And you read 2 Kings 23 and 24, and it says, God raised up Jeroboam because he saw the oppression of his people under the Syrians, and because he had a covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, He blessed them. They weren't godly. He didn't bless them because they were good. He blessed them because He was good. And that's the lesson. In Romans chapter 2, we are reminded that the goodness of God should lead us to repentance. We make that argument all the time about spiritual things, don't we? The sacrifice of Christ should move us. The hope of heaven should appeal to us. The redemption of the body ought to give great confidence. Well, what about the physical blessings of God? Yeah, life can be hard. I recognize that, but life can be good as well. You know, there's not anything much as good as a hot chocolate chip cookie or a beautiful sunrise or sunset. Or putting your arm around the person that you've been married to for 26 years and sharing something with them. There's a lot of grand blessings that God gives us in life, little bitty things that are intended to help us to understand the God that we serve is a good God and He wants to bless His people. How dare we forget Him? How dare we get so caught up in enjoying life that we're not grateful? In fact, in the book of Romans in chapter 1 and verse 21 following, one of the reasons that Paul gives for the Gentile word turning their back on God is because they didn't know Him and they weren't thankful. So I'm going to tell, especially those of us raising our kids, we need to teach our children to be thankful. Not just to us. I tell mine this all the time. Yeah, be thankful. I worked hard so you could have that hamburger. Or your mom spent 4 hours dealing with a bunch of crying kids so that you could get to go to the movie. Those are important things, but there's a bigger gratitude picture we need to teach our children. Our children need to learn the lesson of Deuteronomy chapter 6, that when we talk about God to them, we show them just how grand He is. The apostles made that appeal. Acts chapter 14, when preaching at Antioch, Paul talks about God giving fruitful seasons, about the goodness of God. We need to be raising a generation of grateful children because they're seeing a generation of grateful adults. And then the last thing that I would point out that is a responsibility from the great blessings that we enjoy, and that is that we need to learn to be stewards. The whole point of God's blessing the children of Israel in the day of Amos's prophecy was because they had been oppressed by the Syrians. And I don't think the prosperity that you read about in Amos was necessarily exhaustive. I don't think that necessarily everybody in Israel became wealthy. But the nation as a whole became wealthy. And the nation as a whole had the opportunity to enjoy great things. And God gave them great blessings. And part of the reason that He gave them blessings is because they had been oppressed by another people. There were a lot of people in the land that suffered because of the Syrians and the war that was engaged, that was brought upon them. And what God expected His people to do, the people that had wealth, was to take care of the poor, to bring justice to those that were in need and couldn't stand up for themselves. And as you read through Amos, and we read those passages already, he keeps talking about unjust balances and taking advantage of those who have very little. And God is overwhelming in His condemnation of the fact that they wouldn't take what they had been given to help others. And I'm going to tell you, that is a grand challenge for us in our day and age, in our culture, and in our lifestyle. Because we're wealthy people. And if you think you're not, you think, well, you may say that. I struggle. You go over and spend a month in India. Go to a third world country before you start arguing how poor we are. Because the reality is we live at a level of material enjoyment that Solomon never dreamed of. What are we doing with that? Galatians chapter 6, verse 10 says we have opportunity, let's do good to all men, especially those who are the household of faith. The book of Titus in chapter 2 says that we are to be a people zealous of good works. And then when he gets to chapter 3, 3 different times in that one chapter, what Paul writes to Titus is our people need to be doing good works. Our people need to be maintaining good works. People need to be looking for good works. In Matthew chapter 25, when Jesus pictures the judgment scene separating the sheep from the goats, do you remember the standard? He doesn't say, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joys of the Lord because you knew the right answer on the marriage question, or because you didn't bring instrumental music into the local congregation. Are those things important? Sure they are. But what he also says is, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat, and I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink, and I was sick and in prison and you visited me, and as much as you do it to the least of one of these, my brethren, you do it to me. We better be taking all this stuff that we enjoy and we better be helping somebody else. And I'm going to tell you, folks, if we don't, we stand in danger of losing our souls. Beds of ivory bring the responsibility of stewardship. So I ask you, are you any different than anybody else on your street? Are we at ease in Zion, eating fattened hogs from the stalls, laying on our ivory couches, enjoying our life, caught up in the American dream, and slowly but surely slipping away from God? Or are we grateful, humble people that we serve a God that is so benevolent that it makes us yearn to have an association with Him, to be grateful to Him, to use what He's given us to make the world better? That's a dangerous thing, folks. I'm convinced more people are going to lose their soul because of covetousness, materialism, and temporality than will ever lose their soul because they drew a wrong conclusion about instrumental music. So I ask you to think about that, because that's one of the lessons that God gives His people in the Old Testament. And it has been a plague upon God's people forever. Thank you for your attention. I hope those will be some things that you'll think about. I hope that will help you in your service to God. And if we could help you tonight in that service to God, if you need to make something right, we could assist you at all. We invite your response while together we stand and sing.